Welcome to the third quarter of the Paddock The Goals. The Environmental Protection Authority has an important role to play in managing and mitigating the environmental impacts of floods. While the primary responsibility for flood management often lies with agencies like Council to be focused on disaster response and emergency management, the EPA's involvement becomes crucial due to the potential environmental hazards and concerns that floods can bring. We're very pleased to have Paul Radachek, Team Leader, Environmental Protection from the EPA, join us today. Good afternoon, Paul.
Good afternoon, Travis. Thanks very much for the invite.
Now, when we think about the role the EPA plays, we tend to go straight to their regulatory oversight role, enforcing environmental regulations and permits to prevent and address potential pollution and environmental harm. However, it's a whole lot more than that, isn't it, Paul?
Yeah, it certainly is, Travis. When it comes to issues like the flooding that we happened last year, it's really important that our role as a support agency to councils and some of the other state agencies, we really get there and look at what the environmental regulations are. And yes, we enforce those in our normal role. But when it comes to floods, our aim is we really want to help councils and the community actually deal with the floods and recover. Some of that for us is certainly providing advice about where waste can go, granting emergency approval so that when we do have large volumes of waste being created through floods, that we can actually temporarily put it somewhere where it's safe and we can help the community manage that.
Can you take us through the EPA's, some of their other emergency response processes? Let's start with monitoring and assessment and provide a few examples of the work you might do.
In terms of the monitoring assessment, a lot of it will be initially our officers out, monitoring where waste is going, making sure that we've granted any approvals required, and it's going to those designated areas and not being dumped in areas where it can cause a risk to people. On top of that, from floods, quite often we'll have significant water quality impacts, right? So that's where our officers at EPA will go out and we'll start doing water sampling so we can start providing advice to the community about, okay, what is the water quality? Is it, how suitable is it for certain uses? I know there's certain areas where there's been contamination that we should avoid at this point.
And council's reliant upon farmers contacting us to report stock losses so we can provide advice to ensure regulations related to proper disposal of deceased livestock to prevent environmental hazards and health risks are undertaken. Can you tell us about how the EPA partners with council during a flood cleanup such as disposal of deceased livestock and what those requirements are?
Yeah, so really good question, this one, because these are the events that cause mass mortalities, and they're really difficult. Normally what we say dead stock is, can they go to a knackery, can they go to a landfill, etc. But we understand that in these emergency events, sheer volumes of that mean it really can't be done. So we have to look at what's the next best and safest option we can work with councils and landholders to do. And quite often that will be burial on site. So any mass burial of stock does need an EPA approval. And we can grant that fairly quickly through our systems in emergencies. With it, we follow some really basic rules because we want to protect all the people in the community and we want to help protect, the stock that are surviving, etc. So it will be potentially burial at suitable sites where we'll work with councils and landowners to identify those. And look, at some of the guidance that we have out there, it's in the Farm Waste Management guideline, that if you search EPA Victoria on, you should be able to bring that up. It stipulates that we'll be looking at things like you want to be burying stock with 2 metres above the water table. You want to be 200 metres from waterways. You want to be 300 metres from a residential property. You want a really good cover on top of about 2 metres. So our role is really to look at those individual situations and work with councils, work with landowners so we can get an appropriate outcome which protects human health and the environment at the end of the day and deals with these dead stock in a really effective and quick way.
We're often so focused on cleaning up, we can overlook longer-term concerns such as biosecurity impacts, such as disease, persistence and contamination. Can you outline some of those types of concerns?
Yeah, so in terms of that, you've always got a disease risk, and hence you don't want dead stock left around. We also come across issues where there has been certain disease outbreaks. And in those circumstances, once again, we can use emergency powers, and we really work closely with councils and AgVic, right? because we'll take AgVic over the biosecurity risks and we'll look at what most appropriate disposal is. So it's a question of all those agencies working together with landowners, because quite often if you're talking something as a disease outbreak, it's really important that those animals are buried or they've actually disposed of appropriately so we can maintain the safety for people and maintain the safety for other stock.
There was some above and below floor flooding impacts at Charlton and Colgoa in October last year, and this required assessment of septic tanks. Our EHO went out to inspect and provide advice and support to these affected landholders and communities. Paul, can you explain the health risks associated with septic tanks and why it's important to assess them and how council partners with the EPA to provide that support?
So it looks really important with your septics if it's been flooded, because what you're effectively doing, your septic is treating the sewage from your own individual property. If they've been flooded, if there's effectively sewage contamination on your property, it's really important that, we work with councils and landowners, and council's the lead on this, but it is assessed, and we look at what can be done, and then EPA provides advice or broad advice saying if we've had a situation where there's been flooding, if your tank's been flooded or there's ground that's been impacted, what are the different controls that can be put in place? And it might be something as simple as advising that, really full tanks need to be pumped out by a contractor so that we've got capacity, and that when you're using your wastewater and creating wastewater in your house, that it's not coming out and being exposed to the surface. Because the last thing we want people and kids, etc., exposed to potential sewage. And that's what the septic system's in for, and the waste management system's there for, is to protect public health and make sure that, these things are operated well and it's dealt with in a way where community aren't going to be harmed.
We're reminded that every flood event's different. Our recent event is no exception. It's important to acknowledge that each flood event's unique, and our recent experience has been exactly that. So our community infrastructure's undergone significant changes, including the decommissioning of the channel system that previously directed considerable floodwater away from our area. However, during this recent event, we observed a shift in the flow of water, leading it to new locations, and additionally culverts that typically aid in water transfer are now contributing to the complexities of the situation. One example is our experience at Sea Lake, where there's an existing tip site situated near the watercourse leading to Lake Tyrrell, which had not been considered under threat before, and it became a major concern for the incident controller, but unfortunately, or fortunately I should say, that didn't eventuate. What data is the EPA collecting on flood impacts, environmental damage and recovery efforts, which will contribute to research on flood resilience, disaster management, and the development of strategies to minimise environmental risks in future flood events and assist councils like Beloit, Paul? I know that's a big question. I'm sorry.
Oh, it is, and it's multifaceted. It's multifaceted in that there's one aspect that we've been out collecting water quality data and providing that. And you ask about the data and the lessons learned. Well, you're right, every flood is different, and we've got to be dynamic in the data we collect, and then actually work with councils and communities to get that information to the communities and any potential warnings or any potential heads up so that we can protect public health. Some of the things we've done that way more recently is EPA's got a little bit more kit where we can do E. coli, which is very much an indicator of potential pathogens in the water. Now, where that used to be taken to a lab and it was potentially a week turnaround, we can now do that and actually provide a turnaround in our own facility within about 24, 48 hours. So it's that. Other information, you raised the Sea Lake and the landfill that's there. Look, it makes us look harder at where some of these sites have been located. We knew about the site. We've been proactively working with council, but some of that flood information and the risks of that come in, and that'll help us with working with councils and planning to say, well, how do we rehabilitate sites like that, and how do we rehabilitate when there is the risk of flood, right? Also goes for, we're always learning about there's waste generated out of floods, and we've certainly looked at that. We've issued emergency approvals where there's not appropriately waste facilities or they're full, and we'll continue to do that, and we'll continue to look at our abilities to do that in a quick way and really support the community in both dealing with it and also on the recovery side, because we find that's really important to get our communities up and running appropriately again, and not having waste lying around, not having the associated risks.
Paul, thanks for your time on the Paddock the Goals today. We look forward to continuing to work alongside yourself and your team at the EPA to support our below communities.
Thanks very much, Travis. Really appreciate the opportunity. Always a pleasure to work with the Council. Thank you.